6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, 0. We have commit and we have liftoff at 2:13. Pounds of thrust, and it has cleared the tower.
Prepare yourself for a world of seriousness. This is
Good morning, everyone. Conley here with the Science Night episode. Yep, Science Night. You heard right. In the morning. And we are here with Dr. Sean Graham, all the way from Australia, hanging out with us this morning. And we're going to be talking about the mystery, the construction. We're going to be talking about a little bit of everything involving, Stonehenge, right?
Stonehenge.
Now there's
Bloody Stonehenge. Yeah, man, I'm excited about this. Stonehenge.
Well, I mean, how do you put your finger on what the purpose of somebody going out there or something going out there and putting these rocks that have defied, what time itself, it seems like.
Right. I wanted to do the show pretty bad for a couple of reasons. One, I'm no expert on Stonehenge, and I've only recently ever stopped to take a little minute and read anything about it and learn anything about it. But it's one of those things that's like the main reason, I'll be honest, Conley, you're kind of a foil for this episode. You're kind of the straight man. Because it still irritates me that we've done a couple of shows where you're really interested in some of these ancient things. And we did a whole show on the what were those climate anomalies at the end of the Ice Age?
Yeah,
I forgot.
Younger Dryas. The
Younger Dryas and all that. And the possibility there's this super popular nut that's out there. It's got his own Netflix series who's,
he wrote convinced. He wrote in his book to me, and I've had conversations with him.
Wait. But I'm not sure if we're talking about the same person. It'd be amazing if we are.
He has he has a Netflix series now.
Yeah, okay. And
Graham
he's been
Hancock?
on Joe Rogan. He's been on Joe Rogan.
Graham Hancock?
Yeah, that must be him.
I love Graham Hancock. We have had email conversations back and forth.
That's incredible. Yeah,
and he sent me his book and wrote in it.
That's amazing. So he's convinced that there was a Mesopotamian civilization based on basically no evidence.
I love Graham Hancock.
And my complaint about this, which we talked about in other shows, is that people for some reason are not happy enough with the amazing things that real archaeologists discover, right? And it makes me if you just took a moment and go and look at the stuff that has been found in the last 20 years about just about any archaeological thing you want to talk about, you will be blown away. But if you're only going to be happy with a supernatural or UFO type explanation, then I'm afraid this show will suck for you. But I picked Stonehenge because it's a really good example, right? It's the one that you had in your little book when you were a teenager that was like Mysteries of Stonehenge, right? It was on Unsolved Mysteries. Was on, it's the thing that cannot be explained, right?
That's what they advertise it as, yeah.
Am I on the right track here? So
you're on the right track.
Yeah. So it's one of those it's like the pyramids, it's like Easter Island. It's like the Nazca lines, right, where humans couldn't possibly have built it, so it must be made by aliens, right?
No, not really. I don't. Okay. That's what the History Channel really kind of has soiled that idea.
Exactly.
And it's awful.
Right. I'm not going to pick on you anymore. I'm going to pick on History Channel because they're really, and the other cable broadcasting garbage have really destroyed what could really be an exciting topic. Right. And it is. Stonehenge is super exciting. And another reason why this is cool, and I'm going to make my point eventually, is that, if you read a book about Stonehenge, and there are a ton out there because, the Brits, the British people in England, they love, rightly so, they love this stone monument, right? It's the most amazing thing on that island, right? Archaeologically, it's incredible.
They sell a lot of coffee mugs.
Rightfully so. Every coffee mug on Earth should have Stonehenge on it because it is an amazing site.
Yeah.
And the Brits love it, and so they write tons of books about it. There are a bunch of books about it, but the thing is, if you get a book out of the library, go to the used bookstore, get yourself a book about Stonehenge, and it was published before about 2008, it's totally out of date now. Yeah. It's one of those things that just in the past like 5 years,
wow,
archaeologists have discovered some stuff that has totally blown the lid open about Stonehenge, such that here we go. We're gonna
let's dive in.
We're gonna develop the framework for our show.
Okay. What
are the questions you can ask about Stonehenge? Right? Why, who, what, when, how, and where? Right? Those are the questions you can ask.
Yeah. Basically, any question in the world you can ask with that.
That's pretty much it. Those are the questions you can ask.
Yeah.
And literally in 2008 or 2005, you would not have known the answer really. Well, you would have known a few of the answers about when, because we've had radiocarbon dating and pretty good radiocarbon dates for some of the structures at Stonehenge for a while now. So we knew some answers for when, but pretty much all the other questions you wouldn't really have been able to answer very well. And now we have pretty solid answers for all of the questions except for the one that is, to me, the least interesting. Which is the least interesting to me, being a scientist?
Why?
Yeah, why? Yeah. Who gives a who cares? Why? You can make up any answer you want, right? Why they built it?
Yeah.
It was to worship the flying spaghetti monster, obviously.
Sure.
And you would be just as right as if you said, oh, it was a burial monument, or it was a calendar, or it was, the sun god and the moon god. These are questions. That's a question that really we may never know the answer to, and so why even ask it?
Well, that's funny because that gives way to a playground of speculation between the non-scientific community, right? People that just love mystery,
right? Yeah, that's another kind of piece of the reason why I want to bring this whole topic up for Stonehenge, especially because I want people to think about why you care about that why question so much, and why don't you just throw it in the garbage because you're never going to know. And it's the why the why question that I think trips people up, because you can still be interested in Stonehenge and all the other questions: who built it, how they built it, what they built it with, where it was, and what the geographic context and what other monuments might have been around, and where the stones come from, how they built it. We know that now. We know, and whether or not it would be easy or hard to build, we kind of know that too. So it's that's incredible. And literally, we only know the last 5 years have blown the lid off of this, to where 20 years ago, 30 years ago, certainly 1100 AD, when the first historical accounts where anybody wrote anything about Stonehenge, nobody had a clue. And now, because of scientists and not because of Graham Hancock or I'm
going to play devil's advocate. Well,
modern Celtic druids or Wiccans, none of these people would have ever found the answers to these questions. And they would have never known. We could have never figured it out if we left those people in charge. And instead, archaeologists, who I consider scientists, they consider themselves anthropologists, or some of them do, but I think they're the hardcore scientists of history, and they've got the answers to almost all the questions, and we're going to answer them on this show today.
Okay, I'm looking forward to it. In Graham's defense, and I have read many of his books, and all he simply do is begging the question. But there is a community of science out there. There's a science community that you might be part of, or they may have looked down their nose at you, right, for giving these speculations. Same with the Younger Dryas. That I remember Dr. Thomas Schiller used to laugh at me saying it was pseudoscience, and now it's being proven.
Yeah.
So there
is some of that to science, and I'll admit that there is some with really profound and big kinds of theories. when they're first proposed, often there is, and there should be too. Science is self-correcting, and there's going to be they're going to attack something that isn't in the mainstream.
And they're brutal.
But at the same
too.
time, they're often they're like none of the stuff, all the stuff that I just mentioned, the who, what, when, how, and where of Stonehenge, none of it will be. There's a little bit of controversy. They're arguing about certain little details, but it's rewriting the history book of Stonehenge, and in 100 years, all of that information will still be the same. All
really?
those questions, yes, because it's like stuff they found in the ground. It's like DNA. It's things that are it's
DNA
minor stuff that doesn't like the little details nobody cares about, right? If I just told you that, wow, they found a few pieces of flint in some holes outside of the main stone circle that you see, and some pottery pieces, and they were probably crushed by rocks, and that means there was a stone placed on top of them, and we've got pretty good radiocarbon. See, it gets boring when you get it like that, to the nitty gritty.
Yeah.
But the overall story is remarkable and interesting. But the little nitty gritty details, that's the kind of just daily digging stuff that archaeologists do that really is irrefutable. It's going to be mountains of little pieces of evidence like that get you the answer to these other questions. And there are plenty of scientific discoveries that are so kind of ordinary like that don't get argued about, that immediately get accepted because they're so obvious. And that's actually more common than this boogeyman of scientists who look down their nose on new discoveries, that people like Graham Hancock, of course, are going to say, oh, they're never going to believe me, just like they never believed, so-and-so whenever they discovered that, something or other wasn't the mainstream. So they're gonna cherry pick those examples of where science had a major find and there were a lot of arguments about it. I'll just say something like, plate tectonics, right? The first person who said the continents moved around got laughed out of the room, right? Yeah. Of course, it's just preposterous. And of course, over time, we developed enough evidence where it turns out that's how it works. But there are other examples, where immediately we discovered something and said, wow, this changes everything, and we all know it, and it's so obvious, and it's crazy how stupid we were to not believe this in the first place. And it immediately happens. And so, honestly, that's kind of what's going on with Stonehenge. There's so much cool stuff that the story, the answers are coming in, and it's a crazy, remarkable story. And the why question's boring, and I couldn't care less about it. But we'll even get to the why. We'll end probably on the why.
Because I have not really a why question, but it is kind of how, and it kind of bleeds into other kind of like speculative, anecdotal type science, right?
Yeah. And then, so which question should we tackle first?
Well, first off, I think where is a big one.
Yeah. So where did the rocks come from?
Yeah.
So now we got that nailed down pretty well. It's incredible. And I'm saying we like I'm some sort of an archaeologist. I'm saying we because I'm a scientist. And again, this is one of those things that the Wiccan festival people would have never found out. So geologists.
Let's set the landscape.
So Salisbury Plain in southern England. Right. And of course, these books about Stonehenge are full of descriptions of England that are probably really good if you know England well. And if you don't, it's just a word soup of, places like Dorchester and Salisbury and Marlborough that you're like, wait, is that North Carolina? Is that where they make the cigarettes? So it's hard to follow some of this stuff. But southern England, the chalk plains, it's this area where there's a bunch of chalk. And chalk means that, at least nowadays, it's a very basic soil type that it forms. And so it would have been like a natural prairie back when Stonehenge was being built. In the early phases of Stonehenge, it was probably forested. But later on, when the main monument was going up, it was a natural prairie, a grassland. And so and it should be said that there's a ton of standing stone monuments and earthen kind of circles and things like that all over southern England, and even in places like Scotland, the Orkney Islands, and in Ireland. So this was not just like a single place where this was the only game in town and this is the only place where people built stone monuments of any kind. They were very common during the Neolithic, during prehistoric England days, right? And Stonehenge just happens to be probably the most remarkable of all those monuments. It's got a lot of weird things about it. It's the only one where they, stack giant stones on top of each other. So it's remarkable, but it's not unprecedented. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
And so that sets up the geography. And there's lots, like some of the things we're finding out recently, just in the past 20 years, 5 years, is that even in the environment that right around Stonehenge, within like the 3 or 4 miles right up the road, there was a site called Durrington Walls, which was another earthen circle. There may have been a wood circle they called Woodhenge, and there was probably a large village or even city there at the time. It may have been the largest settlement in England at the time. And it was right next to Stonehenge. So that gets to the kind of who built Stonehenge. Obviously, the people who lived at Durrington Walls, that's where they lived.
Yeah.
And they built this monument right down the river from where the village was. And honestly, like Durrington Walls, the fact that it was a large village or even maybe a city, that's come from excavations in the last 10 years.
Yeah.
Right. So brand spanking new, the discovery of the city, of the people who built Stonehenge, that's mind blowing.
How much do we know about like the language of and the writing, because there are carvings on it?
Yeah, zero. The language. So we can get some kind of indirect evidence of the language based on the other part of the who question of who built it. This gets back to the ancient DNA stuff we've been talking about recently.
Yeah.
So that's another thing that's only come out in the last 5 to 8 years. So let's do a quick timeline of just the people who lived in England in the last 10,000 years.
Wow.
So 10,000 years ago, the Western hunter-gatherer people, that's what we would maybe call them. Remember, if you guys can go back and listen to our ancient DNA episode, modern Europeans are basically a melting pot, an amalgam of 3 separate populations genetically of people. And we have evidence of these people from their ancient DNA. So a burial 8,000 years ago, they can get DNA out of that bone. Couldn't do that 8 years ago. Can do it now. So we know that Europe 8,000 years ago was mostly hunter-gatherers, and there were 2 groups, one in the west, one in the east, and they were super genetically different from other people in Eurasia at the time. And they were probably as different from each other as modern Europeans are different from people in Asia today. So recognizably human, but if you met them on the street, you go, hey, where are you from? That's how different they were.
Wow.
So the Western hunter-gatherer people were there in England, and they actually built a few things at the modern site of Stonehenge that probably were just there incidentally and had nothing to do. So the earliest evidence of any archaeological stuff at Stonehenge are like 4 post holes where they put up pine trees in some sort of maybe like a totem pole just outside of modern Stonehenge.
Yeah.
And obviously Stonehenge wasn't there 8,000 BC. And so later on, more people came. So that was the first evidence of anybody there. And it was already something, they built something there. We don't know why or what it was exactly. But those Western hunter-gatherer people were around, and they built something there. Now, around something like 4,500 BC, I'm going to be all over the place with my dates as usual, but I wrote some dates down. So about 4,000 BC, 4,500 BC, farmers came from mainland Europe. And their genetic ancestry traces back to the Near East. So there was basically a migration of people from the Near East where farming was invented, wheat farming, cattle domestication, pig domestication. These people moved out of the Middle East into Europe, largely displacing the people, the hunter-gatherers who were there, but in some cases mixing with them genetically. In Europe, or I'm sorry, in England, it looks like there wasn't much genetic mixing. They got there, they would have had to have come by boat. So they brought things like cows on boats to England and started building structures like these earthen circles and smaller stone circles and things like that. So that was the second kind of group of people that moved into England. They got the initial phases of Stonehenge going. The first kind of earthen ring that is there still at the site, and maybe even a small stone circle inside of that ring. They were farmers. They probably used the Salisbury Plain to graze their cattle and did some wheat farming and maybe did some mixing with the original hunter-gatherers, but in large case, the original hunter-gatherers kind of died out in England, and they didn't leave much of a genetic heritage. Later mixing with hunter-gatherers in Europe means that all Europeans, modern Europeans, including most Americans, white people,
Right.
have some percentage of those original hunter-gatherer in their genome. It's still there. It got mixed in. But in England specifically, there wasn't much mixing that went on.
Wow.
Okay, and there's a third group that we'll get to later that's the really new and exciting group that we talked about in our ancient DNA. The other part of the Who built Stonehenge. They came much later. They probably brought horses to England, and that was a couple thousand years later, and things got really exciting then. And a really remarkable thing about that third pastoral group that came from the Eurasian steppes, north of the Black Sea, maybe the first steppe invasion of Europe. The really remarkable thing is that when they appear in England, it's around the same time that the big stone monument of Stonehenge was really built. The big stone circle and the big trilithons, those big standing stones where there's stones placed on top of other stones. It was right around the time those people showed up. And I'm not sure if the dating really tells us for sure which group built that huge structure, whether it was the newcomers or whether it was the original agriculturalists. I'm not sure if the carbon dating and the archaeological evidence really lets us know that at this point. But that's really exciting because there's no doubt, there's no coincidence that the main structure that we know now as Stonehenge turned up and was built at the time of this invasion of people with horses,
Right.
pastoralists, who were doing some very unusual things in Europe, and then they came to England. So that kind of
is there a disparity in the erosion? Like to show this gap in time? Like, is there a parity in erosion?
The archaeologists are kind of all over the place in terms of some of the older archaeologists were like, oh, these, and there was some archaeological evidence that a new people showed up around this time, and it was based on like pottery and burial types. These, the bell beaker people, they called them. And some of the people were like, archaeologists back in the 50s, they were like, oh, it was an invasion. They were killing everybody. And then they built this big monument on top of an old one to show who's boss in the area, kind of a simplistic narrative. And of course, everybody, more in the 60s, 70s, 80s, archaeologists are like, oh no, it couldn't have been something bloody like that. It had to have been, peace, love, and harmony, and postmodernist lovey-dovey, and it was just the local indigenous population adopting new techniques. And we've come full circle because now it's pretty obvious that it was really some sort of an invasion, probably not a happy time, probably not peace, love, and harmony, but quite a bit of terrible things happening.
Yeah, all the whys are coming up, but we're about to get to our first commercial break. We'll be right back, and we're gonna knock out these other questions, And towards the wrap up of the episode, because see, this is bringing up all the whys, right? the most interesting and speculative question, right? And
but it's allowing you to ask a better why question.
Yeah, it definitely is. So we're going to get there right after a quick commercial break.
Hey, everybody, welcome back. I'm the Science Knight in the morning with my Squire, Conley.
Faithful Squire.
Faithful Squire.
Yes.
Making sure that we interpret things correctly here. So we asked the who question about Stonehenge, who built Stonehenge, and we're going to have to quickly jump into the when question, because I think that's the main question that's conjured up after you ask the who, because we talked about three groups of people who contributed to the archaeological site that is modern Stonehenge, and they lived at kind of different times. There were hunter-gatherers, there were farmers, and there were maybe pastoralists who had horses, and that's over a span of several thousand years. So the earliest people who were around 8,000 BC were hunter-gatherers. And then around 3,000, 3,500 BC, up until about 2,500 BC, farmers from the Near East who had migrated through Europe and had mixed a little bit with hunter-gatherers. And then finally, this oddball pastoralist group that came from the steppes of Asia, who may have been, were genetically different from the rest in modern Europe. So really, the story of Stonehenge is the story of modern Europe. All the three main genetic groups that contributed to modern Europeans contributed something to the modern archaeological site of Stonehenge.
Now, when you talk about steppe people, are you talking about like Hun era? Like
no, so the Huns were much later. And
much later. Okay.
If this
this predates the Huns.
Yeah, by a lot. If this Bell Beaker culture, or the Yamnaya as they're starting to be called, if it was like a serious invasion from the steppes, it was the first one. It was the first step to invasion. And this is why I don't know why archaeologists have to kind of, some of them are backpedaling and saying, no, maybe it wasn't an invasion. It's like, look, what does history tell you? How many times have people come from the steppes of Eurasia and gone into places like China and India and Europe and invaded and left, a genetic signature, and as well left, burning buildings in their wake? It's happened a lot. It's happened so many times, it's nearly impossible to remember all the different groups, Scythians, Huns, the Xiongnu, and I forget all the rest. They keep coming, and it's like
they do the same thing every time.
Yeah, and like the most recent example of this, there was a Mongol invasion, a small one, in like the 19th century.
What?
Yes, like the last one was really recently.
That's crazy.
Some of the herders got together and they were able to invade, and it's incredible. So this might have been the first invasion, and they may have been the people who, at least if they didn't directly build the big megalith structure of the sandstone Sarsens, the Sarsen Circle, and the Trilithons, if they didn't build that themselves, they probably inspired the building of it by an earlier group of people. So they definitely played a role. They were around when it was being built. So that, I guess we kind of did answer the when a little bit, but we'll focus on this a little bit more. When was Stonehenge built? It was built over thousands of years. The final product, if you would have gone to England around 2400 to 1900 BC, you would have saw a huge stone circle of those sandstone circles, and they wouldn't have been falling down on top of each other like they are now. It would have been a really good stone circle supported by uprights with a bunch of stones sitting on top in a circle, and inside that there would have been a horseshoe of the trilithons, two stones holding up a third stone on top. Mm-hmm. And with a bunch of other small, less famous stones in the middle called blue stones, which we need to talk about.
Okay.
And so that was the final stage of Stonehenge. And then over the last, 4,000 years, it's been falling apart. It got started during the Neolithic, maybe 3,500 to 3,000 BC. There were agriculturalists around, and they were building weird little mounds, and there's a huge, long alleyway of digging called a cursus just north of Stonehenge. It would have been the first kind of real obvious site in the area where they dug a like nearly kilometer long trench in the ground that nobody knows what it was for, of course. And it would have stuck out like a sore thumb because that chalk that they were digging into is white.
Yeah.
And so imagine like a grassy prairie turf, and then you dig a 1 kilometer long lane and then dump all the contents on one side. It's like a big white line.
Yeah.
And then just, a few centuries after that, the first, what's called a henge, the name of henges, these little kind of trenches that are circular, comes from Stonehenge, but there are a bunch of them. And it's just like an earthen mound with a trench around it.
Yeah.
And, so this is the first structure. And the rest of the stone monument it's important to know about this structure because the rest of the stone monument, its geometry is based on that original structure that's really freaking old, 5,000 years old or 5,500 years old. And a bunch of small holes. If you dig archaeologically, you'll find these little holes. In fact, they were found a long time ago, like in the 1600s by this guy Aubrey, who dug at Stonehenge, and he found these holes in a circle just inside the mound and trench. And these are very important holes. Not many people know about them. They're just sitting out there, and you can't really see them because they're covered in grass. You only know that they're there archaeologically. There's stuff in those holes. There were bone fragments in those holes, cremation burials, plus artifacts, little pieces of pottery, little pieces of stone tools. And all that stuff looks like it was crushed. So if you read a book in 2004, 2008, you would have read, and they used to think that those were post holes, and there would have been a wood circle. But now, the fact that they were crushed, and the fact that they were all really irregular instead of perfectly circular, which is what you'd expect if there was circular posts in there.
Okay, so there
were stones, big stones in those holes. And so the original Stonehenge were smaller stones in a circle inside of a trench and inside of a little hill. What were you about to ask me?
Dude, okay, well, and crushed bone, right?
Well, they were cremated, so cremation burials, and then seemingly also crushed.
Is there any kind of correlation to the amount of chalk that's found in that area? But so for the listeners that don't know, chalk is like we said, white. It's very porous, so it's like really light, but it's made out of these like tiny little marine organisms, right?
Yeah.
So it's metal as hell, right? Yeah.
If only we had a geologist or paleontologist who could come on the show and tell us what chalk is.
Well, luckily he taught me in his class, so and I thought it was the coolest thing. I didn't see chalk ever the same way again when you're just drawing with tiny little fragments of bone. I think that's so awesome. But
if only if we could, when we get to the stuff about lunar and solar alignments, if we had like an astronomer to come on the show, he could really give us some insights on that.
That would be so cool. We need to look some of them up, man. We do.
We'll have to find some.
Yeah.
But yeah, so to the chalk and so where were you getting with that?
Yeah, so what I was getting with that is and that's going to get to my question in the last segment. And but
we're simmering, we're building up here, we're adding some ingredients. Good.
Yeah, there's definitely some correlations here with what this thing is doing, right? And what it's doing there, right?
Yeah.
So we're building.
Yeah. All right. So let's flash forward. So around 3000 BC, just a earthen monument in a circle with a ditch, and then probably a stone circle with about 55 smaller. And when I say small stones, please make no mistake, we're not talking about like a marble here. We're talking about like a 4 foot tall stone that would have weighed tons.
Wow.
So and the reason why we know that is because there are a bunch of stone circles like that are in existence that aren't as famous as Stonehenge, but they're all over the place in England, Ireland, and like even on the mainland coast of Brittany in France. And so it's a pretty good guess that there was a original stone circle there. And it turns out there are stones even that are still present at the site that are contenders for what was originally in that in those Aubrey holes. They're called the blue stones. They're still there. They're not all accounted for. And so basically they were moved probably from the Aubrey holes that are kind of far out on that earthen embankment and inside of the larger stone circle that they erected a couple of thousand years or 1,000 years later. They took them out of the Aubrey holes and they moved them inside of the Sarsen stones.
Right.
And they're the blue stones that are there now. So the final product, about 2,600, 2,500 BC, out to 1900 BC, because it looks like they did some finagling. They moved things around. They moved the blue stones inside of the Sarsen circle, and they made a smaller circle of blue stones and even a horseshoe-shaped structure of blue stones with those stones that were probably originally in the Aubrey holes. Incredible. None of this we knew. If you read a book 2008, none of this is really known. Now, here's where it gets crazy.
I love crazy.
This is nuts. This is nuts. I love this. So I started investigating these Aubrey holes and the blue stones. And this is one of these cases where, like, if you focus too much on the main cool thing about Stonehenge, which is this big Sarsen stone, sandstone stone circle, and the trilithons, which weigh tons and are humongous, and if you forget about the blue stones, they've started focusing on the blue stones that are much smaller but still weigh tons and are incredible. Using petrography, which if we had a geologist around, he could tell us that's the kind of microstructure of the stone, the mineral grains using like electron microscopy. They were able to sample some of these stones and they were able to figure out exactly where those stones were quarried. And it's 100 miles away in Wales.
Right. Yeah, 150.
150 miles away in Wales. Like the Sarsens, the big sandstone things, we think they probably came from just up the road in Marlborough. It's like 15, 20 miles away. So not that impressive, but they are super heavy. We'll get to maybe the how if we can. But the blue stones came from much further away. And they using really detailed geological and chemical analyses, they were able to track down exactly where they came from, the Preseli Hills in Wales. And they discovered the quarry. Mm-hmm. We know where they found, because they basically found these places where they were able to wriggle them out using stone, what are those things that you stick in wood to split wood? Oh, God.
A wood splitter?
We'll call it a wood splitter. A stone splitter in this case, probably wooden mallets. And they were able to jack these things out of huge stones out of a quarry 3,500 BC.
Whoa.
They were able to do this. Now, this is even crazier. They found basically there's an old stone circle that's only got like 4 stones in Wales. And they did a dig there, and they found that there was about 55 holes there originally. And that was probably and the dates line up really good. And that was probably the original site of the blue stones that they moved to Stonehenge. And that's how they got there.
Wow.
And that's bananas. They found an empty stone circle in Wales by digging
an
everywhere.
Empty one. Wow.
An empty one. And and some of the like the holes, even like you can use a jigsaw puzzle kind of thing and go, yeah, that one would have probably fit there. The dates line up. They got some good dates using brand new techniques, luminescent soil dating, which is kind of hot off the presses. And they've pretty much, if not the stone circle that was, so originally Stonehenge, the blue stones were probably in Wales. They may have actually found the empty circle where it was, and then they moved it. And remember, these people had boats because they brought cows to England. And if you can bring a cow to England, you can probably maybe move a small, 3 foot, 4 foot tall rock from Wales around the coast and up a river to Salisbury Plain.
Right.
And if you couldn't do that, it's not that big of a deal. You had cows, you could use oxen and a sledge to move them 150 miles.
Yeah, just float those things, though. Use buoyancy and drag them behind your boat.
Yeah, a boat. Yeah, somebody did some half-assed experiment using a boat, and they weren't able to get far, and it fell into the water. But it's still like, a half-assed 21st century university professor trying to move a stone is different than an expert, ocean voyager
from the
35
time. Yeah.
They probably could handle it. They should have tried the same experiment using a cow, and they would have probably failed. and they definitely moved cows. And then they moved horses. And this thing, I don't see much of this, and they're not talking about this much. But if those Bell Beaker people got there 2600 BC, 2500 BC, they undoubtedly would have brought their horses with them, especially if they were doing some conquering. Mm-hmm. And so it could be that we should not be talking about Stonehenge as being a completely man movement type monument. Like, undoubtedly the Easter Island sort of thing was like that. There was no livestock there, so people had to move those stones. But it could be that the big sarsen stones, the big sandstone blocks that weigh multiple tons, could have had horsepower to move them, which I think changes the game. Mm-hmm. I don't think to move something like that using horses only 15 miles, 20 miles, I think we shouldn't be thinking aliens anymore, because they probably, first of all, they definitely had oxen, and oxen aren't as good as horses, but they're pretty good at moving stuff. And if not oxen, they might have had horses to do it, in which case it becomes a lot more explicable how they were doing the moving.
Yeah, no, that's brilliant. And, people at that time had to be clever. Like, they didn't have all the distractions that we have now. They were perfectionists. They weren't on Twitter or YouTube or playing video games. They were honing their skills, and they were basically physicists 24/7.
I think something that really goes to that point is the way that those the big trilithons and the stone circles sarsens were built. They had probably the most remarkable things about them is that they had little pegs and holes, where they interlocked. And it's like woodwork. So somebody was like, look, we can do this. We'll just do it just like we would with wood. It's going to be harder, but we're going to turn these big rocks and we're going to make a ball and socket joint just like we would if we were joining wood together. And everybody probably looked at that person and was like, you're nuts. It doesn't work. And he was like, look, if we've got 400 people doing this round the clock, and they're made to do it,
which they do,
because we've got a skith to their head, they'll do it and it can work, right? So I'm pretty sure that's probably like the guy who designed Stonehenge probably never took a wooden mallet to a rock in his life, his or her life. But the people, and then they were like, look, you guys figure out how to actually do the sculpting of the rock. I'm not going to have any part of that. I'm going to sit here on my mound and eat pig guts all day. The rest of you are going to figure out how to smooth that rock out. Anyway, so the how questions are becoming super, super ordinary now. It's like, it could have been boats. There's a lot of really cool experimental archaeology that they do where they take a rock the size of a bluestone. They use only tools and materials that the people of the time could have had, ropes and, antler axes and wooden mallets. They make a wooden sledge, and they got like 40 or 50 high schoolers to see if they could move that thing. And they were able to do it pretty well. And so, scale that up, and you could have brought, and especially then use horses instead of people, and easy. You could have just dragged those big rocks, probably even farther if you wanted to. So the how questions are becoming are really kind of getting ordinary now. So we've answered how, we've answered where, when. The what we've kind of got to, like, what are the rocks? We got into a little of that. The who we've really got. How much time we got before the next break?
We got to get to a break, but I think after the break we know which question we're going to be getting to. I'm really looking forward to it. Let's keep it right here. Don't touch that dial. We'll be right back with more Science Nights in the Morning. All right, everybody, we are back. What an awesome episode already. We have, hit the nail on the head with all these mysteries of Stonehenge and how, very doable it is to get these things up and about. We've answered all the questions except for a very important one, and that is the why question. And that's where we get to have a little bit of fun, right?
That's right.
Any kind of why question is always going to depend on your own your individual creativity and your own boldness to go out into the unknown, right? So I do want to ask you about this because I actually looked this up yesterday on a completely different thing, but it does relate to Stonehenge, actually. So in the early 20th century, there's an archaeologist named Alfred Watkins who believed that ancient monuments like Stonehenge were aligned along something called a ley line. And what a ley line is basically like it's a connection between a whole bunch of different ancient sites. And it is straight up pseudoscience. It's not accepted by the mainstream archaeology world because it's not something you can really measure, right? But it really helps me kind of try to figure out what the why is in this instance, because that is something you can't measure. Like, it's not, I mean, it doesn't have to make sense.
It can, that's not as pseudoscientific as you say, because you could hypothesize that Stonehenge belonged to a larger kind of ritual landscape. Right. And maybe they built Stonehenge and other sites nearby with the other sites in mind, and that's testable.
Yeah. Well,
and in fact, it looks like that is the case. That, like, Durrington Walls is nearby, and the Woodhenge at Durrington Walls has a solstice alignment, like Stonehenge does, where it looks like the winter solstice. You look down Woodhenge on the winter solstice, and the sun rises from its little aperture, and it's the opposite Stonehenge. The sun sets through the aperture on the winter solstice at Stonehenge. So you can kind of imagine a bunch of druids starting at Woodhenge in the morning, getting super hammered and feasting all day and doing all kinds of, connubial, bacchanalian stuff, and then walking down to the Avon River, and
there's an Avebury circle of stones. It's like a stone circle just outside of Stonehenge.
There are little alignments like that. Now, just to say it with no evidence and going, oh, I think they're aligned with other, then I think that's like, okay, anybody could say that about anything.
Right,
but
right.
It is actually testable. Incredibly, there's a Southwestern archaeologist who pointed out that some of the most remarkable sites in the Southwest all fall on the same exact meridian of longitude.
Yeah.
So Chaco Canyon, the Casas Grandes site in Mexico, and several others are like within a hair of the same meridian of longitude, and they're all they're consecutive.
Right.
They weren't all built at the same time, so they were like following the line. And they're hundreds of miles away.
Right,
it's
exactly.
And that pattern is not just, it could be chance. There's probably some chance involved, but he's probably onto something. It's pretty crazy.
And that's, that is something. So if there's a solar flare today that knocked out all the electricity, and say we I've used this with you before, but there's no
don't tell me
identifier of Wi-Fi, or any kind of we lose so much technology, and so and it's just speculation. I'm not saying it is, but I'm just saying there could be some kind of ancient lost technology, or maybe through any kind of spiritual ritual. I don't know what you call it. I'm not sure, but there could be something that can make more sense of this than just coincidence, right? What kind of technology is that? I don't know. We probably forgot about it, and we're comparing it to our technology now. So how are we ever going to be able to pinpoint that if we're not even working on the same playing field, technology wise? So I think it's really cool to think about ley lines and think about the spiritual energy that kind of brings the world together. And maybe these are hints, maybe these are lessons, right, from our ancestors, and it's up to us to be the scientists out there and put a lot of effort and energy into solving some of these mysteries, because that connects us a little bit better with our ancient world.
Yeah, I think putting yourself in the shoes of those people in those days probably, and archaeology and even especially anthropology has some things to bear here, because there is something to be said for understanding. We've gone away from the idea that human civilizations are on this scale,
Right.
that hunter-gatherers are primitive and that they were replaced by agriculturalists, and the agriculturalists become, city-states, and then city-states become empires, and it's like this progression of humanity. That's all kind of antiquated. But there is really something to be said for, studying what's left of modern hunter-gatherers to try to get into the mindset of the hunter-gatherers that would have been there at Stonehenge before it was built.
Mm-hmm.
And if there's anybody making stone big megalith monuments anywhere in the world now, they might have something to be able to tell us about what was in the mindset of the people who built Stonehenge. And it turns out there is such a thing. There's a culture in Madagascar
Wow.
that builds big stone monuments, and the guy who's really blown the lid off of all this archaeology that's going on in Stonehenge right now, and I better look up his name instead of just saying that, and give him credit for everything I've said on this episode. He's got one of these names that's like so common and ordinary that it's hard to remember.
Oh yeah. Any kind of phone book, you can look him up.
Yeah,
But
and if you just Google Stonehenge archaeology, you'll get him. Mike Parker Pearson. He did stuff. He did digs and archaeology in Madagascar and met some of these people, and he's like, it's so brilliant. It's like, what did you guys do this for? And they're like, oh, the stones are our ancestors. Boom, boom, and it matches up perfectly.
Yeah.
Cremation burials, crushed by blue stones. So you bury your loved ones, and then you erect we still do it.
We do.
We still do it. We do it.
Yeah, gravestones, baby. Yeah.
We're still doing it. And
Wow.
that's incredible. And it's like, why didn't we ever just slap the face and go, wait, we do this.
Right.
We erect stone monuments over dead people. We still do it. We put their name on it because we love them. We want to remember them.
Yeah.
And it's of course, this is like a Scooby-Doo ending that nobody who wants Stonehenge to be built by aliens will ever accept or want. But it's so ordinary.
Yeah.
And it makes so much sense. It's got to be true. That's
Yeah.
what it was. That's what it was.
That's brilliant, man. That is brilliant. And just had a great time on this episode. Really kind of opened my eyes to reading and interpreting things in a different way, because it's so easy to jump to conclusions and say, yep, this is it. But to actually analyze it and use technology in a way to where we're learning and growing from each other's mistakes, right?
Yeah.
And we're not judging each other for it. That's what's the beauty when science can come together with that speculation and actually take those into consideration.
Yeah. And I think it's just one of these stories that I think where science can really toot its own horn. It's like, okay, you guys like this stuff. You like mystery. You like this. Here we go. We solved almost everything.
Yeah.
And it's awesome. And it's awesome. I don't think it diminishes the mystery at all.
No,
To me, it's like I wasn't interested in Stonehenge at all when it was just, oh, we don't know who built it.
Yeah. Wow.
When it was those kind of, like, I could care less. It was like, it's really neat. But like all of this stuff that they found in the last 5 years has completely mesmerized me and engrossed me, and has made me like, it really blows your imagination away. It makes you wonder what they would have looked like and like how they did it. All that stuff, it's remarkable. All of that has made me excited. All the science has made me excited about Stonehenge.
Yeah.
The old Time Life book stuff about it was always boring to me. This stuff is exciting, and again, I'm tooting science's horn here. The Wiccan festival goers would have never given you this stuff ever in a million years.
Yeah. And it is a testament to the human spirit and the will of humans to respect what they're doing, like, hey, we got this. Look at this. But anyway. All right, that's another episode of Science Night in the Morning, and we'll see you next week with another great episode. Thanks so much for tuning in. Thanks for listening to this episode of Science Nights in the Morning. Be sure and follow us on Patreon for exclusive gear and uncut episodes. Check out the latest science articles on our Facebook page and subscribe to us on YouTube and your favorite podcast listening app. You can also listen every Saturday at 10 a.m. Central Standard Time at BigBenRadio.com. And if you got a question, we'll join the discussion. Hit the hotline at 432-217-1983 and record your message. We couldn't do this without you, and thank you so much for listening each and every week. That's Science Nights in the Morning with a K, and we'll see you next time.